The Sunday Baroque podcast is made possible by WSHU and the Friends of Sunday Baroque. You can find out more about the Friends of Sunday Baroque and find out how to become one yourself by visiting our website, sundaybaroque.org, under the Contact tab. Oleg Timofeyev is a musicologist and an instrumentalist who specializes in lute and Russian guitar. And for nearly 4 decades, he has focused on performing early music on authentic instruments. He's particularly passionate about 19th and 20th century music for Russian 7-string guitar. And in 2020, he released a download-only album of music by 18th century Russian women composers. Oleg Timofeyev made time to speak with me on Zoom about his musical activities. It is so nice to speak with you. Welcome.
Thank you so much. It's a great pleasure for me too.
So these are strange times in the world. How are you doing during this pandemic?
Well, I can start from the most important thing for me. I wrote my dissertation on the Russian guitar in 1999. Mm-hmm. And for all of these years, there was the talk that I will rework it into a book. I even received several grants where writing a book was part of the deal. But one grant brought me to Russia, the other grant brought me to Ukraine. And there were so many interesting things. I was so preoccupied with performance that I was not writing my book. Oh. And now, during the pandemic, ironically, is the time when, there's no performance to speak of. So I may as well write. Oh. So I have a contract with Cambridge Scholars Publishing. Mm-hmm. I just signed a contract. I'm in the middle of my writing, and I have to say it's extremely far away from the dissertation. So many things changed in the last 20 years that I'm not really reworking my dissertation. I'm just writing a new book.
Wow. Well, that's great. What a wonderful use of your time. And you're healthy, and you're even making music online sometimes.
Yeah.
Good. So you're from a musical family. Your mom is a cellist, and I believe you have a very long history of music making in your family going back generations. Would you talk a little bit about your musical family roots?
Yeah. Usually, the Soviet citizens didn't go further back than 3 generations back. So basically, my grandmother is as far back as I can go. She grew up in a Jewish family in Kherson. Mm-hmm. She had several, with the last name Wexler, she had several musicians in the family, amateur and professional. And one of her uncles left for France and I think graduated from Sorbonne, published Chopin's preludes with his own fingerings. That was kind of what he's remembered for. His name was Serge Wexler. And he left a number of pieces as a composer, one of which is called Poème symphonique, La tragédie de la vie. Now, I don't know French, but this title appeals to me. So I was trying to find this Tragédie de la vie score for a long time, found it in Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris. And, and I have it, but it needs a double orchestra. So far I cannot really find a place that will want to perform it. My grandmother was basically prepared for the concert pianist career, but as she says, in the 1920s, she overplayed her hand. Uh-huh. And the way I read it is that she basically chickened out. 1920s was a very difficult time, mm-hmm. Civil war and so on. Mm-hmm. There's famine. It was not the time to play Chopin in public. So I think that may be the true story. Mm-hmm. But she was my major musical influence. And whatever I was doing in Moscow as a child, she was supporting me, accompanying me on the piano. For my mother was working day and night, and her musical impact actually is more of a more recent times. When I was writing my master's thesis, she was helping me. Now we work together quite a bit because she lives 10 minutes away from where I live in Iowa. But my grandmother was kind of a career at a super romantic school. Like she said that her teacher, I don't know his name, was a student of Liszt, of Franz Liszt, something like that. So she was, or maybe he was the student of a student. But basically, the point is that she had this incredibly romantic understanding of what music was, and if she was given two measures of music, would make an incredible drama, and it would be all rubato, and that there was nothing like mechanical playing. And I think that I got some of it, maybe too much of it, but that's, overall pretty good and rare in today's world. Romantic performances was kind of somewhat eclipsed by the more modern approach of the 20th century.
Wow, neat. So, did you start making music very young? I mean, how did you start playing the lute and the guitar and instead of following in your mom's footsteps as a cellist?
Well, I didn't actually originally follow their footsteps in music. I didn't show any of the talents that they were famous for. I didn't have this incredible musical memory. I didn't have this incredible perfect pitch that they both had, and everybody else. So basically, since for both of them, music was something difficult and uncertain, they strongly discouraged me from being a musician. So I first started as an art school, pretty serious, trying to be an artist. And then my interests kind of switched to math. And I went to a special school for mathematically gifted children, which was actually a very good thing, because there I immediately realized that I was mathematically really average. I mean, I was rubbing shoulders with some of famous mathematicians today.
Wow.
So I really started playing guitar out of desperation. And, very quickly learned quite a bit. Just was totally self-taught. That was an interesting time of guitar in the Soviet Union, because guitar is a relatively new thing. I mean, the return of the guitar, so to speak. It didn't have the same tradition in Russian culture as violin or cello or piano. Actually, it did, but nobody knew about it. And this new European, cosmopolitan Spanish guitar, nobody really knew how to play it. So I was already playing serious pieces by Villa-Lobos and so on, but I've never seen in person someone who played better than me. It doesn't mean that they didn't exist, but, I saw people on TV, I saw some foreign artists. And at some point, my mother supported me by bringing me to some guy who was also a guitar teacher. And he said, "Oh, young man, you're so good, you're playing so well, I cannot really give you anything. But I will send it to my teacher, who is exactly what you need, a really very demanding, very, very, stern teacher who will bring discipline and so on." That sounded very scary. And at the same time, kind of exciting. And so he brought me to a very interesting person called Camille Frauci. The last name Frauci is musical. I mean, there is a violinist in the US called Jennifer Frauci. It's the name of Swiss origin. And in Switzerland, it's pronounced Frutti. This was a very interesting person who developed his own method to teach any musical instrument. Actually, he was a violinist. He spent 8 years in Stalin's Gulag, and he developed a certain philosophy of life and art, and he kind of, experimented with it in his students. And many years later, after his death, I was wondering, was it just me who was like 19, so inexperienced, or was he really that interesting? And I decided, together with my wife Sabina Gulz, we made a film about him, a documentary film, with basically collecting memoirs and various things that his students remember. And we also were lucky to get some audio and video recordings of his teachings, of his attempts to write a book. And, turned out that he was indeed absolutely amazing, and his students were not nearly as interesting, and nobody really understood completely what he was teaching.
Wow. I was going to ask you about that. You are a documentary filmmaker in addition to your many other accomplishments.
Well, that was our first film. And it was an interesting topic that united music, beauty, Russian history, history of immigration of Swiss of the Swiss people to Russia before the revolution, KGB, Gulag, all of that was in one sort of 49-minute long movie.
Wow. So, how can someone see this? Is this online? Is this something that someone can go to YouTube?
Actually, this is in free. It's accessible for free on the Vimeo now.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I can send you the link.
Great. And we'll put a link.
Yeah, I
with the
believe that
interview.
it's of interest to anybody who plays any instrument.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely. So, you are particularly interested in the Russian 7-string guitar, and I would like for you to please explain the characteristics of that instrument and beginning with how it's different from the guitars that most people would be familiar with.
In terms of its physical appearance, the Russian guitar is not that different. You can say, I have many guitars in my collection, including very early ones, and they, of course, are very different from the, from the modern concert guitar. But if you look at what a guitar looked like, if you compare it with what guitar looked like in Europe, it basically followed European outlines. It was much narrower. It looked a lot like a Baroque guitar, like a Sunday Baroque guitar, like the type of guitar we see in the paintings of Watteau, Antoine Watteau. But it always had 7 strings. And most importantly, it was always tuned to a G major open chord, which, colloquially is called open G tuning. That is somewhat surprising, maybe, because we always associate Russia with something in minor, and here you have an instrument entirely in major. So the history is very nebulous on the one hand, but certain things are completely clear. Russia of the 18th century was a meeting place of many different cultures. Some guitarists were originally from Italy and France, basically Western Europe. And they played the guitar that basically is a predecessor of what classical guitar is today. At the time, it only had 5 strings. And then there were people who came from Poland or Bohemia, and some from Germany, and they played a cithern, basically a guitar-like pear-shaped instrument with metal strings that were at different pitches, not always in G, but they always had this chordal tuning. And somehow we cannot just pinpoint that one genius who connected the tuning of one instrument with the body shape of the other. But it's more of evolution rather than revolution. Like some people attribute it to Ignaz von Held, a Czech musician, or Andrei Sichra, another Czech musician in Russia. But indeed, it was happening at the same time in several places, both in Moscow and in St. Petersburg. So, towards the 1860s, it acquired the second neck. But that again came from the West, came from Vienna. So, in a way, there is speaking as an entrepreneur who constantly tries to market this art, sometimes I find myself in a difficult place because, it's not exotic enough. It looks like a guitar, and nobody's going to count strings. And, to someone who is not paying attention, it also sounds like a guitar. So the differences in sound are extremely subtle, and they go back to the fact that one of the most influential, I can simply say the most influential guitarist in Russian history, Andrei Sichra, originally a Czech born in what was called Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. He was born in Lithuania. He originally was a harpist. His first instrument was harp, and everything he did on the guitar was somehow to imitate harp or to sound like harp. Basically, he was trying to get the sound that was really dear to him. And he created a way to play passages that are very much, today's guitarists call it harp effects. A lot of overlaps and a very nice kind of airy sound. And that that in order to hear that, first of all, you have to have it. I'm saying this because in my, home country, Russia, there are still people who play this instrument, but they already are corrupt with the Spanish guitar approach. So you wouldn't hear the same airiness, the same free-flowing harp-like sounds that I'm trying to cultivate among my, students and various disciples.
So you've made a bunch of recordings over the years, and before we talk about this most recent recording, I want to maybe just kind of go through some of them. Like, you've got these 2 volumes of the golden age of the Russian guitar. So what was this golden age, and who were some of the composers in that golden age of Russian guitar?
Well, the life of Andrei Sikhra, the great guitarist I mentioned, conveniently outlines the first half of the 19th century. He began his publishing in Moscow in around 1800, and then he died in 1850. So that's what I call the golden age. Now, in Russia, the words golden age are used slightly differently. It's the same words, but we don't have to say golden age of. We can simply say Russian golden age. And everybody understands that it's the time of Pushkin, who died in 1837 in a duel. But in American English, we have to say the golden age of. That's where it came from. Interestingly enough, I taught on Fulbright. I taught in Moscow, and I shared my CDs. They already both out. Both volumes of Golden Age of Russian guitar. And this expression became extremely common in Russia, even not applied to the 7-string guitar. Like, they have a festival called the Golden Age of Guitar. Just, copycats of my CD cover. What can I say? Yeah, this is not a concept specific enough that you can sue people, nor would I get involved. But at some point, I ironically wrote a comment saying, where did you get this title? Yeah, so it was a relatively short and very quickly changing time. The first sonata for violin and 7-string guitar was published in 1799. So that's the first publication that we have, the end of the 18th century. And then the generations exchange extremely quickly. So people belonging to different generations lived simultaneously. Different generations of guitarists, a student of. And already in the 1840s, it was the beginning of a decline. And the decline meant that from a highbrow playing, from an instrument that everybody loved in a salon kind of atmosphere, the instrument that was much depicted in literature, it became a folk instrument. Not really folk, but it was much more democratically played. Merchants, or the Roma or gypsies, everybody was playing it. And so there was no highbrow music published. In fact, for a while, there was no music published at all. And people were kind of complaining that now the music is so rare for this instrument. And then in 1880s, German publisher, by the way, music publishing in Russia was almost always by Germans. So the publisher called Gutheil, he started publishing what we can call today facsimiles. So he was reprinting earlier publications. And so that's why, like, there's tons and tons of printed music. But what's interesting that what happened to the instrument later, and that's why we're doing this excavation, talking about the Golden Age. In 1917, as you know, happened the Great October Revolution, and guitar, no matter how many strings, became associated with the White Army officers, with the Roma, with the merchants, with the idle class, with all the wrong things. So guitar, there was really like proletarian resistance to guitar. It was a symbol of a bourgeois lifestyle. For example, there was a report that in a paper that we visited such and such, dormitory of workers of such and such factory. Everything is fine. The hygiene is good. In the 20s, they're worried about various problems with hygiene. And then they say, but what a terrible thing. What terrible taste. They have a guitar on their wall.
Oh.
So there was considerable considerable purchase against the guitar, and clearly intimacy was not valued. It was at the time of mass marching accompanied by brass bands,
Yeah.
Soviet, etc. And that attitude dramatically changed when Andres Segovia visited in the middle 1920s. He visited Soviet Union more than once. But when he was there, the revolution of the opinions about guitar changed only one way. It turned out that guitar is a real instrument. You can play Bach on it, etc., but only the six-string Spanish guitar.
Ah.
And throughout the 20th century, we had this very strange opposition of the new cosmopolitan guitar that for some reason we were supposed to learn to play, and at the same time not many people knew how to play it. And it was from the 1930s on, it was this conditions of the Iron Curtain. So people couldn't go to Spain, for example, or to any other place and learn something. So people, the local guitarists of six strings were generally of rather low quality, much inferior to the West. And those who actually still remembered how to play the seventh string and who learned it from their maybe family members, they didn't have any outlets for their work. So that was the sad history of the guitar in the Soviet Union during the 20th century. And only towards, only after perestroika, only after the world opened up, the Russian six-string guitarists began to travel, take master classes, win in international competitions. Now there is a great Spanish guitar school. But what about Russian guitar? Nothing. Very few people are doing it, and the level is also not outstanding, not amazing.
You're changing that.
Yeah.
So in 2020, you released this new recording of music by 18th century Russian women composers. And first of all, I want to make sure that listeners understand that it is a download-only album. There is no physical CD. Who are some of the composers on this recording, and what's special about their particular compositions that you've included?
Well, it's been already so long ago, 2018. I mean, I recorded something else since then. First of all, I should say that this is a continuation of the previous project that I had on Dorian recordings, which is called Music of Russian Princesses from the Court of Catherine the Great. At that time, we didn't know about the format digital download only. It was in a physical format. And it was very successful. We got the Noah Greenberg Award of American Musicological Society for that. And at the time, we, and by we I mean that was an ensemble called Talisman that by now no longer existent, but it consisted of Anne Harley, the singer, Irina Ries, harpsichord player, and Etienne Abelin, violinist from Switzerland. So at the time, I remember that we had to scramble because, the idea was great. It came about because researching music for the Russian guitar, I discovered that the Russian women composers were the first composers who actually published romances, those love songs, under their real names. Oh. So that's kind of something difficult for us to realize, but in Russia, maybe longer than in European countries, the profession of a musician was not particularly, or of a composer was not particularly prestigious. It was actually quite a job for either a serf or a foreigner, just like a barber or a cook. It's not the same about poets. Poet was always compared to a prophet, and prophet is important. But composers were kind of hesitant to publish their music of the ruling class, of the noble class. Mm-hmm. So Russian female aristocrats probably had less to worry about it. And so they published their romances, and those who published guitar journals, those were journals for the five-string guitar in 1796 and 1797. Mm-hmm. The two Frenchmen were publishing it, Henglez and Millet. And they were, one was in Moscow, one was in St. Petersburg. One was publishing music by Princess Dolgoruki, of whom actually we only have two pieces from that journal. And one of them were put on that old recording from 2001. and Countess Golovin and Princess Kurakina. So that's just basically digging in those in the old guitar music. I discovered those names. Then I went after them, so to speak. Turned out that Princess Kurakin and Countess Golovin were both very noticeable, very noticeable persons who actually kept diaries, who published their books, who were well connected. And in case of Kurakina, she published more than 50, and she didn't publish, sorry, she wrote more than 50 romances, more than 50 songs. So in the first recording, I didn't know all of that. And so we had to scramble and include, God forbid, music by some men who wrote variations on romances by women composers. One of such things we have in this current recording, and those are the variations of Anton Eberl, German, very multifaceted, serious composer, but he wrote variations to the tune, to the romance of Kurakina, Princess Kurakina. Basically, we approached, Princess Golovin was very close to the wife of Alexander I, the German princess Elizabeth of Baden, who was nicknamed, who was, her Orthodox name was Elizaveta Alexeyevna. And so she was the dame in waiting, or whatever it's called, and she was known for her beautiful contralto voice. But of course, all the songs we find, they always notated for a very high voice. So in this particular collection, we just approach it very loosely. We take the tune and we put it in the range in which the current singer I work with, Anna Beneta Diouf, from Germany, excels. That fits the range of her voice. When we talk about Russian women composers of the 18th century, the first thing in the Western mind is that in Russia they already had any composers in the 18th century, and when you narrow it down to the women, it sounds like an artificial construct. So just to clear this up, I would like to say a couple of words on what the 18th century was like in Russia. During the century, we had at least 3 serious female monarchs. One of them, Elizaveta Petrovna, the daughter of Peter the Great, and the other one, Catherine the Great, who was ruling for a long, long time. And her ruling definitely inspired female aristocrats to do amazing things, not just compose music. So one of our heroes, Princess Dashkova, for example, she was put in the head of the first woman, the head of Academy of Sciences, even though she was not a scientist.
Wow.
Catherine was accepted for a variety of reasons, but one of them was that, that Catherine was ascended to her throne as a result of the military coup that cost her husband his life. And the minor Catherine, Ekaterina Dashkova, supported her in that. She was very young and very charismatic, and it was important for a German princess who wasn't settled yet. So Catherine forever remembered the support, but she was cautious. She was not always, their relationship was not necessarily very cordial. Interestingly enough, when Catherine died, Paul I, her son, who pretty much was destined to reverse everything his mother did, and in many ways, especially considering her favorites, he sent Dashkova in exile to meditate about the events of 1762, meaning the involvement in his father's death. So that kind of outlines her career, but the last years she spent indeed in exile. But it's also interesting that she lived in Edinburgh for a couple of years, And there she was wounded by a Scottish lady that she challenged for a duel.
Whoa.
Like, imagine that. Like writing nice songs for harpsichord seems like nothing. I mean, it's a very, very specific and very interesting area of study. I mean,
Wow.
I was reviewing a book about by Inna Naroditskaya about Russian 18th and 19th century music, and my review was called Russia's Male and Female Centuries, because basically what would agree with her interpretation that the 18th century was a female century. That was the time of the women, of the powerful women.
Mm-hmm.
Not many people know that. But of course, those powerful women were not in any way disadvantaged. They had ambitions just like men, but they were not, nobody was shutting them down. They could do whatever they wanted. And, true to the spirit of the time, most of their songs are about love, about longings. As some reviewer of our first album said, those princesses must have been bored. But in a nice, nostalgic way. That's basically what we can call Russian music before Russian music. Everybody thinks of Mussorgsky, Tchaikovsky.
Right.
No, there was a Russian music considerably earlier.
Uh-huh. Tell me a little bit more about your collaborators on this recording.
Well, the collaborators are really great. The harpsichord player is from Kiev, Ukraine, Olena Zhukova. I've known her because I lived in Kiev for a year and a half when I was on Fulbright. I was teaching there, and in the same institution, the Glier Institute, taught Elena, or Olena, depending whether you call it in Russian or in Ukrainian. We worked on the recording already in Kiev, so we knew each other pretty well, and so that was a natural choice. I mean, of course, there was no bias really, but for this project, I thought it would be great if it's played by mainly female performers. The singer, Anna Bineta Juf, is a very interesting young opera rising star in Germany. She grew up in a family where Russian, for some reason, was around, although she has no Russian blood. Her father was from Senegal. And so he studied in Leningrad or something like that and had some kind of cult of everything Russian. So from her early days, she was singing in a children's choir in Russian. And so, we crossed paths when I was in Germany for a while. And, that it's already our second recording. Our first was a collection of Russian romances, just Bineta and I. They're just voice and guitar. And, interestingly enough, the necessity to sing in Russian very much narrows the pool of singers who would be excited to do such a thing.
Right.
Because everybody sings in Italian, everybody sings in English and French and German. But if you say Russian, there are not that many people who would be willing to do that. But first of all, she was willing. And second of all, actually in this repertoire, on the territory of Russian women composers of the 18th century, Russian is not absolutely essential. Kurakina, Princess Dashkova, they all wrote romances in Russian, but the majority is in French, and quite a few are in Italian. In the unique case of Princess Dashkova, who's sometimes called Minor Catherine, Katerina Dashkova. Minor Catherine as opposed to Catherine the Great. She was an extremely influential woman during the Catherine the Great's reign. In her case, she actually wrote quite a bit in English.
Huh. Wow. And you're a violinist?
Yeah, and the violinist, I forgot to mention. The violinist is kind of goes without saying. It's Ingrid Matthews, a friend of mine for many years. But this was the first opportunity to actually work together on a Baroque project.
Great.
There's the greatest piece that she plays there comes from the 21st century. It works like that. There was a very interesting interesting musician, Sinyavina, who was married to the Admiral Vorontsov, I think. And there is a famous Vorontsovsky palace in Crimea, of all places. But somehow its collection was gutted when Ukraine became independent, and basically it's all in Moscow. So in the so-called Glinka Museum in Moscow, there is a manuscript of her sonata for harpsichord and violin. And I think the violin is mentioned as ad libitum, but I think it's rather important. The problem is that, as usual Italian sonata of the time, it has 3 movements. And for the first movement, we have both the violin and the harpsichord part, and you can hear it on our first recording from the 2001, the music of the Russian princesses, performed by Irina Ries from New York and Etienne Abelin from Basel, Switzerland. Then in that manuscript, you get the second movement, which is Adagio, and it only exists, only the keyboard part is extant. And for the third movement, you only have some sketches, not even clean copy of the violin part. Apparently it's a rondo, but that's already quite something. So I approached a friend of mine whose talents I always admired. His name is Dmitry Goldobin. He lives in a very kind of, how should I put it, in a place that is a myth, in a city in the south of France called Cannes, where the Cannes Festival.
Oh, yes.
And he teaches musicology, I think, in the college or conservatory, as they call it. But he just is a genius in terms of ability writing or improvising in different styles. So I asked him to write, a violin part for this keyboard piece. And of course, sometimes, the way the sonata works, if you think of imitation, if you can probably kind of come up, any musician could come up with something. In the worst case, you can just have the part simply accompanying. But he's such a master of counterpoint, he just squeezed in completely, independent, very passionate part that I deeply admire.
Yeah.
So that's what Ingrid recorded.
Oh, it's lovely. How can people get a copy of this download-only recording?
That actually is, to some extent, mystery to me too. One could go to, this is the first time I'm trying to do that. And, this is a philosophically very important area, and I'm trying to understand what to do next. Okay. Because these days, it's difficult to sell CDs at your concerts, but assuming that the time will come when we have concerts.
Right.
It's very difficult to sell CDs because people say we don't have a piece of equipment to put it in.
Right.
And nobody really needs them. People refuse to take them as gifts. So something needs to come instead of them. Yeah. And the streaming services and so on, they're all not made for the artists.
Right.
God knows whom they benefit. Certainly not us. So this is my first attempt to have it kind of a shared project with the Profil Hensler Classics.
Right.
And this is a company in Germany with which, it's a famous label that they have. It's probably one of 2 labels that have the complete Bach. But, we have the agreement that it's our shared project. And there's no physical body for it. So to answer your question, you can go to Amazon and download it.
Okay.
I don't know if you can really download the booklet that we actually worked on, and it's quite informative and rather pretty.
Yeah. Well, they can listen to your interview and at least fill in some of the details.
That's a possibility.
Do you have some next projects that you're already working on yet, or anything you can tell us about?
Well, I usually, people kind of joke about my approach as a man of many projects. So I'm working on so many different things at the same time. I kind of slowed down a little bit during this pandemic and became more of a writer. But my partner of many years, John Schneiderman, and I, we're working on Skype. We actually were working on Skype and Zoom long before it became the only way to work.
Mm-hmm.
So because he lives in California, I live in Iowa, 2 hours difference, we just get together and play. So right now we're preparing music by Mikhail Vysotsky, who was one of the most original musical minds during the Russian golden age of the seven-string guitar. So he only wrote variations on Russian songs. He wrote other pieces too, but they're impossible to make sense of. Except that at some point he wrote an adaptation of a Bach's fugue from the Art of Fugue. It's also very messy and very difficult to make anything out of it, but I did record it. So that's the project. It's it's a little bit continuing in what I already did, so it's not quite that different. I'm working with my Romani partner, Vadim Kolpakov, who grew up in the Romani tradition. We're working on a project called Django in Russia. It's a completely different idea. It's Django Reinhardt has never been to Russia, but we are trying to create an alternative history and just sort of, basically it's a way to turn Russian pop songs from the 20s and the 30s into gypsy jazz.
Great. Well, look forward to hearing those projects as well. Oleg Timofeyev is a lutenist and guitarist and musicologist based in Iowa, and he joined me on Zoom to chat about his new recording, Music by 18th Century Russian Women Composers, and about his career in music. What a pleasure to speak with you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It was a great pleasure to talk to you.